They mocked me at my mother's birthday dinner until they realized who they were dealing with. The whisper cut through the laughter like ice. I heard it even before I saw the woman, because some insults travel on the same frequency as certainty. "The stinky country girl is here," Sloan said, leaning toward Patricia as if confiding in a co-conspirator. Her voice was the sort that expected an audience to agree. It settled neatly on the polished candelabras and the stretch of Italian marble underfoot. I stood at the edge of the ballroom, a glass of water halfway to my lips, and watched them look at me as if they had the right to assess worth. The monarch's chandelier threw light like an accusation. The band played a standard waltz. People in gowns and sharp suits kept their smiles steady. Garrett, my brother, passed me a plate loaded with hors d'oeuvres he had no intention of eating, the same practiced smile he had kept since childhood for people who liked the idea of him more than his company. Patricia, my mother, glanced my way and then away, the dismissive blink she used when she didn't want to see where her children actually were. For a long time, I let them have it, the look that said I belonged to a smaller map of the world. I had learned early how to become invisible in rooms where my worth wasn't measured by learning pedigree or the name of the country club. I had learned to read rooms the way other people read signs, the angle of a shoulder, the fabric of a napkin, where the power sat, and how close it kept its hand to the purse. That night, the insult stung in a different way, because the banquet we were in had once been my office. The Monarch's ballroom had been the first big lease I negotiated, the space where we launched Burt Hospitality's public brand. I could still map the floor in my head, the seam on the carpet that hid a loose nail, the way the back hallway smelled faintly of lemons from the cleaner's closet, the freckle of a paint chip on the east wall. People didn't usually look twice at the owner. They looked twice at the person they had decided to judge. I was used to it. I had been underestimated so often I could have taught a class on the art of being unseen. But that evening, as the whisper rolled into a ripple of polite chuckling, something quiet and colder tightened behind my ribs. It was not only the insult. It was the notion that these people thought they had a right to rewrite my history to fit their gossip. They were, in that small act, erasing a life of early mornings, of rooms scrubbed until the grout looked new again, of a first paycheck that bought toothpaste and a bus ticket. They were erasing my hands. You might expect that I rose, that I let loose a scathing retort that would have brought down the chandeliers. That was not in me. I had always believed that the work of correcting people was done best with evidence. Quiet, patient, unarguable evidence, rather than theatrics.
So I let the laughter pass over me like a season of weather and kept my face a careful mask. But I listened. I noticed. I folded their underestimation into my pocket. Before I say anything else, there is a tiny favor I will ask, because I write these stories for people who understand the slow burn of being underestimated. If you like these kinds of true-to-life twists and the small victories that follow, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It helps me know I'm not alone on this side of the room. I had not grown up expecting a mother who would see me for what I could become. Millbrook, the little town I came from, was the sort of place with one stoplight and a diner that stayed open for the truck drivers. My father had left when I was 10, the kind of departure that rearranged the furniture of our lives without asking our opinions. Patricia remarried fast, the way people sometimes buy certainty at a discount. She liked the look of weddings and the possibility they offered. Decor, new fabrics, the idea of moving up. Garrett, my brother, was the child she leaned into. Handsome, easy with the town, quick to laugh, and slower to fail. I became the shadow who learned to make things work. There was a necklace involved, an old thing with a small opal framed by brushed gold. My grandmother had worn it to church on Sundays and to the harvest festivals when the town smelled of cinnamon and hay. She had taken me aside the week before she died and pressed it into my palm like someone passing along a coin to be spent wisely. "Keep this," she said. "It'll remind you the world can be kinder than the one you find if you are kinder back." Children dramatize objects into talismans. I did not need the necklace to prove fate. I needed it as a pin on the map, a reminder of where I came from. Later, whenever I had to trade sleep for a shift at the motel or take the late bus into the city, I would imagine that opal glowing in my pocket like a compass. At 16, I left for the city with a duffel bag and a willingness to scrub floors. By 18, I had a job cleaning rooms at a rundown inn north of the city line. The smell of cheap disinfectant and the squeak of a mop became the metronome by which I measured time. My first manager, Mr. Calloway, taught me more than how to fold a towel. He taught me how to listen to the house, to the way a faucet complained before it gave way, to which guest left a note in the wardrobe, to the best angle at which the late evening sun would find a smudge on a window pane and make it look like neglect. He was blunt and a touch unkind sometimes,
but he pushed me to see the business as a body of small problems that could be solved if you were patient and precise. I learned how to fix leaking toilets and how to manage a linen inventory. I learned revenue by the night shift count and the delicate arithmetic of staffing a weekend. I also learned to dislike people who mistook the appearance of ease for competence.
Someone who never had to wrestle with a busted AC unit would speak in terms of managing expectations, as if that was equal to hours of hands-on repair. That division, between theatrical wealth and the steady work of keeping a building running, framed a lot of my anger. I saw where money valued spectacle and where it quietly kept systems functioning. The climb was not cinematic. It was a grind punctuated by small triumphs. A promotion to assistant night manager after a year of midnight check-ins, a first time I negotiated a small catering contract for a wedding that scared the inn's owners, a second-hand interest in a 3-unit property that I fixed up with second-hand paint and no small ingenuity. I learned to keep an eye on debt, to trust the right kind of stubbornness, and to find mentors who preferred to hand me tools rather than tell me to dream. There were moments that felt like proofs. The first was the time I negotiated a bank loan for a small boutique inn, persuading a weary-looking loan officer that my projections were real because my operating days were built on experience, not fantasy. I remembered the sound of the stamped papers like a small exhale. The second was the day I first met Wesley Crane, who later became my general manager, and the reason I slept more soundly than I'd had any right to. Wesley showed up at recruitment one blistering September, a lean man with coffee-stained cuffs and a soft voice that got sharper when he talked spreadsheets. He had the unusual hospitality talent of loving details and people in equal measure. He could balance a P&L while calming an irate guest. We learned to work together fluidly. He could see what the house needed next week. I could see the public-facing narrative we wanted to tell. Birch Hospitality began as a single-minded experiment. We purchased a small neglected property and treated it like a promise. Every cent of profit we could squeeze went back into repairs, into staff training, into the kind of little investments that didn't look impressive on paper, but made everything else whole together. We opened a second property because a previous tenant owed us a favor, a third because we were finally big enough to attract a loan. Each win taught me a lesson in managing pride and patience. By the time I was 34, Birch had grown into a modest but respected regional operator. We were not Silicon Valley rich. We were the kind of business that families trusted when they wanted their dinner anniversaries to be accurate on the kindness scale. Buying the Monarch felt like arriving at an old promise. The building had history. It had once been the town's best place to stay before a string of bad managers turned it into a shell. I saw potential where others saw expense. The Monarch was more than a revenue center. It was a public statement that our brand could hold beauty and service in the same room. The investors, quiet, pragmatic people, liked that I remembered every seam of a service plan. They liked that I could stand where the ballroom now stood and tell them how many more events a season we could book if we tightened the AV cabling and rewired the kitchen exhaust. There was a particular day, crisp and bright, when the key was handed to me. I held it like an invitation. And then, by the second week, I had fallen back into the rhythm of fixing things. The pride lived in the details. The first 90% guest satisfaction day, a review from a bride who had thought we had magicked into place some small miracle of timing, the staff who came early because they wanted the place to be right. And all the while I sent money home. I did it anonymously at first, a cashier's check tucked into an envelope and left in the mail bin, an electronic transfer with my initials omitted, a small stipend so that a bill could be paid and my mother would not have to choose between heat and prescription. There are things you do for family that are not meant to be praised. They are meant to be insurance for the softer parts of us. I knew my help would be reshaped into gossip by people who mistook receipts for reputation. I had seen it before. Someone smelling financial support and assuming it meant my family was lavishly supported by Garrett or some other man. It was easier to be entirely anonymous than to be argued about at tea. My mother, who loved the theater of public approval, never found out for a long time that the money came from me. In retrospect, I often wondered if I should have told her, if I had done her any favors by keeping it quiet. That secrecy complicates tenderness. I wanted my mother to be proud because she had earned the right to feel it, not because I had presented her like a prop in my own narrative. So I let the payments slide into the background. They were my versions of the meals my grandmother used to give. Quiet, adequate, intended to keep the bones from complaining. Back in the Monarch's ballroom, I held my place when Sloane's whisper ruffled the air. I watched Patricia's jaw tense and then release into an embarrassed smile. Garrett, for all his easy charm, did not notice the shift in the room. Or if he did, he didn't know which side of my life the whisper intended to wedge into. The engagement party they had chosen to combine with my mother's birthday was almost a performance piece. Franklin Whitmore and his wife, Delilah, had the practiced air of people who spent their lives auditioning for the parts of substantial hosts. Their house, some large angular thing in the wealthier part of town, had been the subject of more cookbook features than any place deserved.
They arrived with a swarm of assistants and a clear plan for where the photographers would stand. Sloan, Sandra, as I later learned, had the sort of practiced softness people in that orbit find useful. She smiled as if to admit nothing sharp. She had the habit of leaving a conversation in a way that made those she left feel chosen and unchosen at the same time.
It was during the salad course that it happened. Franklin excused himself and trudged into the hallway, his phone to his ear. Later, people would call his composure strained, but that evening his voice on the call was more like a sharp wire. I caught words: timeline, wedding, settle it, and a sentence that planted a seed. "We need this to go forward. No delays," he said. "All of this collapses if word gets out." He had the kind of urgency that served as both admission and plea. I heard the word collapse, and it tumbled through me. I had seen businesses collapse before, the slow erosion of trust that eats at contracts and payrolls. A fake balance sheet could bring a carefully constructed social life down as surely as a bad foundation could sink a building. My stomach pulled tight. The seed in me unfurled into a suspicion, which then sprouted into something sharper. This wasn't just cruelty at a table. It might be a danger that could reach out and touch my family. I could have walked away. I almost did. There were reasons to stay and reasons to leave. On the one hand, exposing anything at a family event could humiliate not only Sloan and the Whitmores, but also Patricia, who loved the applause of the room. I did not want my mother to feel like entertainment in a scandal. On the other hand, there were people in that ballroom, clients, vendors, friends, whose accounts could be stripped if the Whitmores' house of cards came down. There was also Garrett, who for all his softness and ease, would be publicly tied to the same table if the wedding went forward under false pretenses. I thought of the way people lose months of work when cash flows vanish, and of the tempers that turn toward anyone vaguely connected. The better part of judgment told me to gather facts. That had always been my way, to let information have its answer before letting anger loose. It helps in moments like this to have people you can call who will not gasp and invent morals for you, but will instead roll up sleeves and look for paper trails. The first person I called was Naomi Delaney. Naomi was a forensic accountant with a laugh that came out of her like an admissions test, quick, brilliant, and slightly dangerous if you weren't ready for it. We had met once at a conference where she gave a talk about shell companies and how easily they could be misnamed. She specialized in the sort of accounting that looks for footprints in fresh snow, little inconsistencies that suggested someone had been trying to erase their steps. "Beth," Naomi said when I told her what I'd overheard. She did not do dismay, she did data. "Do you have any names? Anything specific? Rich people hide in layers, but they leave fingerprints." I told her I had a name, Whitmore, and a sense that they wanted the event to proceed at all costs. Naomi's tone went thinner, more focused. "Send me what you have." Odds are I'm going to need bank routing numbers, shell entities, transfers, anything that looks like a pattern. If they are laundering or misdirecting funds, there will be a breadcrumb trail. Next, I called Rebecca Thornton, my lawyer. Rebecca had the kind of calm arrogance that makes opposing counsel uncomfortable. She treated my concerns with the kind of clinical attention they deserved. Rebecca and I had worked on a small contract dispute 2 years earlier, and she had been both blunt and incorruptibly competent. "Rebecca," I said, "I don't want to make something worse for the family, but I heard something. I think there's more." She asked for the same things Naomi did, and then added something practical. If there's credible evidence of fraud or misrepresentation, we can involve investigation, but we have to be cautious. Accusations at a private event can lead to defamation suits or claims of public mischief. Let Naomi start the paper trail. If she finds patterns, we'll bring in Agent Reeves. I trust Carla. She knows when to act and when to hold. Rebecca's name dropped like a stone. Agent Carla Reeves was a federal investigator I had met through a hospitality association when a different property had been subject to a coordinated scam. She had a reputation for tenacity and an appetite for cases that touched both financial and personal ethics. Rebecca had worked with her before. The shortness of that network, the fact that Naomi and Rebecca were already people who had done this before, was the real reason I allowed myself to begin. Wesley, who had been managing the Monarch that week in my absence, had already noticed small anomalies in back-of-house schedules and vendor invoices. He'd sent me a text earlier that day with a photo attached, an invoice for 100 linens that had no vendor contact, and a bookkeeping entry that matched a company name we'd never used. He wasn't flashy, he was deliberate, and he had the kind of institutional memory that made him a human ledger. "Keep everyone calm," I told Wesley over a hurried phone call in the service elevator while staff moved plates and a waiter knocked into a cart of silver. "Don't say anything. Lock any paperwork you don't want anyone finding, and keep the AV locked down. Nothing new gets plugged in without me knowing." "Already on it," he said. "Got a guy coming by to test the speakers tonight. Naomi's number is on speed dial." So we began the slow, private thing that passes for strategy. Call the people who could turn rumor into document. I gave Naomi what I had.
Names, the fragments I had heard in the hallway, the pattern of the Whitmore household, a few invoice numbers Wesley had texted photos of. Naomi replied with a series of questions that read like a relay race: bank information, dates, entities. She was the sort of person who asked because she suspected there would be a reason for each request. I felt oddly relieved in her competence.
There is a comfort to being handed tasks when the heart is doing too much work. Naomi's first threads led quickly to more threats. She found in public filings a company with a name that was nearly a pun, a corporate name that suggested stability and trust, and yet had no listed employees and a mail drop in another state. She pinged a couple of accounts and found small transfers that skipped in odd patterns, like a bird beating its wings in the wrong season. The pattern suggested that money was being moved not to shore up a family home, but to feed an operation that relied on continually recruiting new investment to prop up older obligations, a Ponzi-esque structure if the pattern persisted. "Don't say the P word yet," Naomi warned in a voice full of restraint. "It's provocative and wrong if I'm wrong, but there are similarities that I'd want to show an investigator." We moved with the plausible credibility of people who had done this before. Rebecca contacted Agent Reeves discreetly and described an emerging pattern without names. Carla, in the brevity of a police professional, asked for Naomi's early lists, telling Rebecca she'd take a look if the numbers added up. The elegance of established professional chains is that they made speed possible without hysteria. We were not amateurs opening stormy windows. We were people calling in existing favors. There is a peculiar intimacy to gathering someone's paper life. You read through spreadsheet after spreadsheet and see the way they presented themselves to the world. Charitable donations, fly-by-night vendors, the occasional generous entry that looks at first glance like philanthropy, and then under scrutiny becomes something else. Naomi relayed back small calamities: misstatements, transfers routed through shell addresses, invoices for linens that never arrived to any demonstrable property. She found contract copies with forged signatures in one state and payments routed to a company in another. Names came up: Sandra Williams as an alias, a family name attached to businesses with curious lifetimes. All of this was enough to make me angry, but anger is lazy if it's not fed by purpose. My motive from the beginning was not vengeance, but a preservation of the room, of the Monarch's staff, of the vendors who would be left holding invoices, and of family members who might be hurt by association. I wanted to protect those who could not protect themselves from the ripple effects of a lie dressed as lovemaking. On the night after the party, Wesley set up the AV in the boardroom and kept the door open just enough for me to step in and look. He had the kind of hands that were calm. In them, a tangle of wires looked less like a problem and more like a promise. Naomi sent me a first packet of documents: screenshots of bank ledgers, corporate registrations with addresses that mapped onto nothing more than a UPS box in Phoenix, a contact name repeated in filings and in a charity letterhead.
Rebecca handled the legalese like a surgeon, making lists of things that constituted cause and those that did not, drafting language we could use when the time came to confront. I slept poorly that night in my suite at the Monarch. I had wanted to be present at my mother's party, not because I enjoy watching people circle each other like polite predators, but because my being there might anchor something. In the early hours, I remembered Gran's words about the opal, how she had said the world could be kinder if you were kinder back. I thought about kindness as a measure rather than a feeling. If I had to act, it would be to create a space where our people did not suffer for the choices of others. There was a particular ritual before I committed to anything public. I would sit at the old mahogany desk in my suite, the one that had a small scratch shaped like a crescent moon from a child's toy. I would open the safe and take out the opal necklace, letting the cool metal warm in my palm. Strange how jewelry can be a map. When the world is loud, a small object can remind you where you came from and whom you are accountable to. We put together a plan that did not rely on spectacle, but on timing. Naomi continued to build the paper case. Rebecca and I refined the legal thresholds. Wesley coordinated the AV so that everything could be played on the big screens without arousing suspicion. The ballroom's AV system had been our pride, and he knew each input like a page of a beloved book. We needed the right moment to show not just insinuation, but clear patterns: transfers that matched contractual deadlines, invoices that duplicated, entities that had never provided services yet billed handsomely. I did not want to humiliate Patricia, and I did not want to make Garrett the public spectacle of a family torn. Confronting in private had little chance of solving the broader problem. If the Whitmores had constructed a house of cards that touched clients, the only righteous course was to let the truth have its shape in public with the proper authorities present. That meant that if Naomi found enough indicators to warrant an investigation, we would involve the feds. Rebecca had promised to pull in Agent Reeves only when there was a basis to act, because Carla, like most investigators, was efficient and not a drama fan. When a federal agent moved, it was quiet and precise. We began to pull the threats outward from the hallway conversation. Naomi found corroboration not in the bold evidence of a crime, but in small, persistent inconsistencies. Duplicate invoice numbers, suspicious check runs, companies registered and then dissolved on the same day that a mortgage payment was due. It was the kind of evidence that filled pages and told a story in increments. We assembled it into a folder with a plain label, Whitmore, Financial, and mailed a copy to a secure server, the kind of thing you did when you intended to play by the rules.
Meanwhile, the family continued to perform. Patricia toasted to her future daughter-in-law in a voice that trembled with more love for the idea of being known than for the person she was defending. Garrett's eyes, soft, accustomed to being the sun in our family's orbit, were focused on Sloan as if she were luminous. For all his warmth, Garrett had never been wired to look beneath surfaces. He'd been trained by a mother's devotion to take people at their smiles. It made the work of protecting him more delicate. Sloan, Sandra, moved through the room with a practiced poise. At one point, she drifted close enough to me that I could smell the floral of her perfume, expensive, not to be mistaken, and I thought of the way scent can be a social weapon. She offered a smile that meant, we are in the same world, and then pivoted away to be admired elsewhere. I made a mental note of her shoes, calfskin, not scuffed, with a subtle heel that suggested she had practiced balanced presence. Later, when Naomi forwarded me a document showing that Sandra Williams had been used as an alias on a charity board listing that somehow filtered funds to a company with no employees, the details in her gate seemed like character clues rather than mere observation. The 2 nights after the party coalesced into a strange double life. By day, I oversaw operations, meeting with vendors, checking linens, listening to a dishwasher clink in the kitchen like a metronome that warned of breakdown. By night, I read through spreadsheets with Naomi on the phone and watched for the small moment at which enough pieces would fit together to justify action. People slept in their lives and believed their sleep was safe. Those were the people I wanted to shelter. There were small, odd moments of grace in the process. Wesley found a handwritten note tucked into a folder one morning from a banquet coordinator who wrote in a looping script, "Appreciate your care. Keeps me sane." He left the note on my desk. It was the sort of thing that made everything feel less mercantile, less sharp-edged. It reminded me that business could still be tender. After 3 days, Naomi called and asked me to meet in my office. Her voice, usually a machine of cheer and numbers, had an edge. "Bethany, you were right to be suspicious," she said. "But it's not just one county. It links to at least 3 states. There are entities that exist just long enough to handle a payment and then dissolve. There's an alias you should know, Sandra Williams, likely the same as Sloan, and a network of companies registered under Franklin Whitmore's relatives' names." She spoke in a way that was more coordinate than proclamation. Evidence had a rhythm to it. Pattern, plausibility, and then a decision. Naomi's findings gave us the first 2. The third was a moral weight. "Do you want the press?" Rebecca asked when I briefed her. "If we go public with Agent Reeves, it's messy. If we wait for Carla, she might need to develop a probable cause. We should plan for both. Discreet contact with authorities, while preparing the evidence in a way that can't be misrepresented." It felt like planning a surgical strike. Not glamorous, not violent, just precise and necessary. I considered my mother's face, the way she loved being seen, the way that praise had once been the coin she used to make herself feel large enough. I thought of Garrett again, and hated the idea of him being humiliated. I thought of the Monarch's staff, who could lose their livelihoods if the Whitmore's web snapped in the wrong places. All these considerations bent the moment into something careful rather than impulsive. We briefed Agent Reeves. She did not come in with the swagger of television heroes. She was a woman who wore competence like a jacket, practical without adornment. She listened, she asked for exhibits. She had a file number within a day and the sort of inscrutable calm that makes a person believe in process. "If there's probable cause," she said, "we'll move. If not, we'll watch. Either way, don't do anything on your own that puts people at risk." It was her last sentence that mattered most. There are ways to be right that get people hurt if you don't account for the consequences. I wanted to be right and to be careful. The plan crystallized into a sequence that was as much logistical as moral. We would not ambush at the party in the way most people imagined. We would expose using the records, with authorities present, and in a place that allowed the witnesses to see the truth. Franklin loved to make toasts. He loved to stand and tell stories about legacy and community. If we could time a presentation to the toast, show the documents in plain sight, and have Agent Reeves there to act on the evidence if she believed it met probable cause, then we could ensure the narrative landed as truth rather than rumor. My hands were steady as I worked through the checklist. Wesley would manage the AV so that the date and chain of transactions could be displayed. Naomi would prepare her report in concise charts that an ordinary person could read. Rebecca would have the legal language lined up, and Agent Reeves would be ready if the documents amounted to probable cause. We rehearsed like people about to give a testimony.
not for the drama, but for clarity. I practiced the opening lines of what I would say if the room became a courtroom for a night. Economical, precise, not spiced with revenge. My goal, I kept reminding myself, was to protect and to restore. The necklace was a symbol of that restoration in my own mind, the idea that a thing once given could be returned, and that dignity once stolen could be taken back. On the day the plan was to be executed, though I still could have backed away, my mother asked to meet me in her bedroom before the party.
She had a dress on that made her cheeks brighter, a small stack of cards in her hands, like a woman who'd rehearsed gratitude. I wanted to tell her everything and nothing at the same time. I wanted to explain why I was there, and why my presence might save more than it would wound. In the end, I settled for a middle truth. "Mom," I said, "I won't humiliate you. If I have to speak, it will be to protect people." She smiled in the brief, bewildered way she had when she was pleased by being noticed. "You always did like to fix things," she said, "even when you broke them first." It was the kind of mother line you tuck into your pocket like a talisman. I left her with a kiss on the cheek and a promise I intended to keep. When the room settled and Franklin rose to give his toast, everything seemed arranged as if a satin ribbon divided truth from performance. The band softened, the lights tilted just so. I felt the weight of everyone in the room like pressure at the base of a cup. My heart batted once, hard, quick, and then stilled to businesslike. Wesley had the AV cued. Naomi had the finished binder. Rebecca sat where I could see her, her hands folded so tautly she might have been praying. Rebecca's expression said something I could not yet name. Agent Reeves was not in uniform. She sat near the back, watching like an audience member, but with an investigator's attention. All that remained was for Franklin to lift his glass, and for the room to breathe in the way people do before a story. I felt the opal against my skin through my palm and my pocket, a small, steady warmth, as if someone else was holding my history beside me. Franklin lifted his glass, and the room inhaled with him. The chandeliers glanced off crystal. The band softened as if of its own accord. For a suspended moment, the Whitmores looked like the sort of people who could compress time and make everything fall into a prettier shape. Franklin's voice began with the practiced cadence of a man who had given many toasts: ancestry, gratitude, future prospects. He gave us their version of a perfect future. Wesley's hand was light on my arm the way people touch things that matter. He nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, the signal we'd rehearsed. Somewhere behind the smile that had kept my mother placid, and the polite applause that wanted nothing to upset its rhythm, the ballroom's projector came alive. Naomi's packet unfolded across the screen, a spreadsheet with dates and entries that, like a badly edited film, left gaps where evidence had been airbrushed. The first slide was innocuous: a company registration, tasteful fonts, a charitable-sounding name. The second slide began to show the same company on different documents with different addresses. The third slide had bank routing numbers and line items that matched invoices Wesley had photographed in the service office. Each slide was unreadable as a single item. Together they had the shape of intent. Franklin's smile tightened.
He had the look of a man who believed polished rhetoric could keep any room from noticing what a ledger later exposed. He glanced toward the back, perhaps to measure whether the effect was landing, or perhaps to check the photographer's angle. When the slide changed to a ledger with a handwriting example and a duplicate invoice from a vendor who'd never received payment, the air shifted in a way like a tablecloth being pulled. Impossible delicacy, and then things a little askew. I stood, not because I wanted to be center stage, but because I owed the room clarity. I stepped out from where the staff had been blending like discrete shadows, and walked into a space where a microphone had been left turned up by Wesley's careful fingers. "My name is Bethany Burns," I said. My voice did not quake. Years of conference calls and manager briefings had taught me to study the throat. "I own the Monarch and Birch Hospitality. For the last week, people you see here tonight, vendors, members of our staff, and others, have raised questions about financial practices connected to the Whitmore household and a set of companies that interact with your vendors." I let the sentence land. Those questions turned into a pattern. Naomi Delaney, a forensic accountant, reviewed documents I pulled together, and Rebecca Thornton, my counsel, and I asked federal investigators to look, because if the pattern is what it appears to be, people who trusted your wedding vendors could lose months of work and money. It was a gentle scaffold, legal phrasing placed like a protective fence around the story. I wanted the truth to be heavy where it needed to be and precise everywhere else. Naomi's voice came through the room's audio, calm and unadorned, explaining the anatomy of the pattern. Companies that existed only long enough to route money. Invoices that matched but delivered nothing.
transfers to entities with no employees or physical premises, names that recurred in charity registrations and in shell company filings. Rebecca had prepared a one-page timeline that flashed across the screens, dates of transfers, dissolution notices, and invoice numbers that matched the banquet schedule vendors in the room relied upon. The whispering began, first soft, then quickening, like branches in wind. Sloane's face drained of carefully applied color. For a few seconds she managed the kind of plastic composure some people wear in rooms full of witnesses, but it was thinner now, cracks starting to show along the practice seams. Agent Carla Reeves stood. She had waited until the narrative presented probable cause, enough that the evidence suggested a pattern that warranted intervention. She moved with an economy that belongs to those who have practiced precision. Her team were not the sort you imagined on television, full of cameras and grand gestures. They were efficient, quiet, and deliberate. 2 agents broke from the back and made for the Whitmore party.
I had seen Agent Reeves work before. She did not do spectacle. She did the job and left the rest to the law. When a federal agent approaches you at your own dinner because the paperwork suggests possible criminal conduct, the first thing the room's choreography can't hide is the sudden intake of breath. Garrett's face folded in on itself, a private confusion and then a dawning worry. Patricia's hand went to her throat. She had that particular, showy ability to look faint when something inconvenient entered the room. For a woman who loved spectacle, the idea that spectacle might show her in the role of a supporting actor in someone else's story seemed intolerable. The agent spoke quietly for a few moments to Franklin and Delilah at the edge of the room. Franklin's jaw worked like a machine that had been told to stop and restart. Delilah's hands fluttered, small consonants of denial and panic. Sloane began to cry in fits that were alternately real and performative. She moved like a woman who had rehearsed collapse and then discovered an emotion she could not quite mimic. "You're under arrest," one of them said, into a tone that belonged exclusively to men and women who did this work soberly. The words were simple and absolute, the kind of machine that makes a room stop being a social room and start being a scene in the middle of a process. Sloane screamed a version of betrayal, an old practiced play, confusion, anguish, accusations hurled at anyone within reach. She called names, old lovers, enemies, new conspirators, anything to scatter focus from the ledger that spelled out a different story. Franklin and Delilah protested in a register that tried for indignation and stumbled instead into a reality they had not planned for. Security moved quietly, less like imprisoned birds and more like men doing their jobs professionally and without rumor. Garrett stood as if someone had asked him to step off one step too many into an unfamiliar space. For a moment he seemed paralyzed by the collision between his private belief and the evidence playing in a public place. Then he moved toward Sloane in an uncertain arc, like someone trying to reach for a sheet in a windstorm. They spoke rapidly, too rapidly, words that made little sense to everyone else. He asked her questions that had weight. She answered with fragments that had the shimmer of practiced half-truths. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in years, the thing I had wanted from him, an unhedged look, arrived. There was shame there, and an apology's beginning. He took a step back, as if measuring who he had been made by and who he might still become. It was the smallest, fiercest movement. Garrett did something then that surprised everyone, but was the truest part of the evening. He moved to where I was standing, took the necklace from my hand. There are ways families still do rituals in public, however messy, and put it around my neck. It was simple and quiet, the sort of small public redemption that had nothing to do with a press release and everything to do with acknowledging truth in front of witnesses. "This belongs where it's always been," he said, voice low. "You were always the one who kept us from falling apart." The gesture was private, wrapped in public, and it rippled through the room like an honest pain. Patricia's face moved from shock to a kind of immediate, bewildered pride she had not allowed herself for me. For a woman used to applause at parties, the sound of her daughter's worth, spoken without caveat in a crowded room, seemed to disarm an entire lifetime's performances. Agent Reeves read the Whitmores their rights. Sloane, Sandra Williams, as Naomi had concluded, was escorted out in cuffs. Franklin and Delilah were detained. The agents made clear they were being held pending further questioning and processing. Arrested was the word that landed on the air, precise and solemn. We had not claimed convictions. We had not wanted to. We had wanted truth, and truth prefers process to vindictiveness. The photographers had not been invited to this scene, but their lenses were there, an inevitability in rooms that had previously been rinsed with staged light. Cameras flashed, not in celebration, but in the chronicling way news does what it does. It compresses hours into a dozen frames and hands them off to the next morning, where interpretation lives. That evening felt oddly private, and yet wholly public, an oxymoron that a room like the Monarch could carry only because it had been a public place long enough to endure such contradictions. People clustered in little pods, some to console, some to gawk, and some to make quick calls. Vendors who had come expecting a wedding deposit cut in half sat in shocked clumps, relieved and terrified by the presence of law enforcement.
The band packed up without a third song. Glassware clinked in ways that sounded like the end of a movie. Agent Reeves was methodical in her debriefing. She interviewed managers and staff, took lists of vendors, and requested original invoices. Rebecca made sure everything we handed over was documented and properly labeled. Naomi continued to provide follow-ups as she dug deeper. We were careful, always careful, to let the legal mechanisms do their work. I wanted justice, not a caricature of it. After the agents finished the initial questioning and left with certain individuals in tow, people drifted away in groupings that suggested the room had been at once a battlefield and a small, imperfect family dinner. My mother stood in the middle of a circle of guests, palms pressed together in a way that sought to keep her composure. She looked at me in a way that had something like apology at its edge. "I didn't know," she said, less a defense than a plea. "I know," I said, "and I know how much you loved being seen. You didn't deserve to be a prop."
I did not say that I had tried to shield her by preferring to let the payments be anonymous. That truth, my silence, had its own costs, and they were part of the inventory I carried to bed. Garrett and I stood on the far side, the noise of the ballroom folding behind us. He looked smaller than he had at the beginning of the evening, a man whose frame had not been made to carry certain kinds of history. "I'm sorry," he said. The apology was his own and not thin. His hands trembled. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "I know," I said again, because it was true. We had carried different hopes for different kinds of rescue. He'd wanted a normal life where people were who they seemed. I'd learned not to count on appearances. The nights that followed were a blur of interviews and follow-ups. Agent Reeves requested additional documents. Naomi scanned and annotated. Rebecca coordinated with prosecutors, careful not to let public statements outpace the evidence. News outlets called with polite hunger. Our board of investors wanted to know what the optics meant for contracts and occupancy. Vendors asked for reassurance that deposits would be honored. Wesley held the line with the kind of quiet competence that was his profession. He was the one who kept the monarch's heart beating, while the rest of us navigated the legal and social limelight. In the days after the arrests, the Whitmores were formally charged with a series of allegations related to financial misrepresentation, wire transfers, and conspiracy to defraud, language chosen by prosecutors to reflect the seriousness of the pattern Naomi had documented. Charged was a clinical, careful word. Awaiting trial would eventually be the phrase that staked the matter to the slow-turning gears of justice. None of it was simple, none of it was a certificate of moral infallibility handed to us. It was procedure. It was the beginning of an account book that would be reconciled in a courtroom. The town responded the way towns do. Rumor folded into opinion. Sidebars became editorials. People chose sides with the alacrity of those who need to know where they stand in social weather. My mother's friends behaved predictably and unpredictably. Some withdrew from our family, embarrassed for reasons they did not fully understand. Others rallied, offering casseroles and shoulder calls. The local paper ran an op-ed sympathetic to victims of fraud and cautious about villainy that hides in glossy brochures. 3 weeks after that night, at a small table in my office, my mother and I had tea. It was not as dramatic as a courtroom scene. It was quieter, the way real reconciliation often is. She wore a cardigan that made our look less like a party guest and more like the woman who had once ironed my school shirts. "I always thought people like them were safer than people like us," she said, the truth like a small object she had to set down. "I wanted the pretty parts."
I didn't understand the ledger behind them. "You didn't need to," I said. "You did the best you could with what you knew. The hard part is what we do now." She looked at me with a softness that had done something like unbending in her shoulders. "I want to know how to be proud of you. I don't want it to have to be in front of other people." Those were the small stones relaid into the bridge we were rebuilding. We began therapy sessions for her, a practical, ordinary thing, appointments with a counselor who specialized in adult family dynamics and shame. She agreed to go, awkwardly at first, then with a curiosity that suggested she might learn how to sit with feeling instead of just arranging it for applause. Garrett attended a few sessions with us. He and I began to have longer, more honest conversations about money, responsibility, and what it meant to be seen. Meanwhile, the business day demanded a return to ordinary operations. Hotel life insists on the rhythmic, the breakfast service, the laundry exchange, the HVAC checks. There is a humility to running a building that is useful after melodrama. It reminds you of what actually keeps people housed and fed. We weathered some cancellations. Some vendors asked for immediate payment assurances. We worked them into our cash flow. The Monarch's brand recovered because the staff's competence did the slow work of restoring trust. There was a period in the weeks that followed when I had to remind myself that empathy and justice are not opposites. The Whitmores had been arrested, charged, and would face a court. That process could also be devastating for people who might be victims of their own bad choices, or employees who had been complicit out of desperation. The law is designed to parse these things. My position was not to revel in their downfall, but to ensure the consequences were proportionate and to protect the people who had no leverage. A small, surprising thing happened that I did not expect. News of the case spread beyond the town. A woman in a neighboring county reached out, the kind of note that began, "I own a small bakery and I think I'm in the same network." Naomi followed the lead and uncovered additional irregularities, and a few other small businesses we had worried about were spared larger losses because the timing of our exposure forced earlier scrutiny. That felt like a quiet victory, the sort of pragmatic justice that catches predators in webs that depend on longevity and unquestioned goodwill. Rebecca arranged a press statement that focused on the legal facts, arrests, charges, and the fact that investigations were ongoing. We were careful, always careful, to avoid language that suggested we had judged a man or a woman to be morally irredeemable. The narrative we wanted to own was truth backed by evidence, due process, and the protection of those who might have been harmed. Over time, the media swirl subsided into a slower, more careful journalism.
There were op-eds about class and power, about how social polish often hides structural rot. My mother read a few of them and frowned, like someone who had seen a picture of herself in an unflattering light and, in private, wanted to reconcile with it. She began to see the truth not as an enemy, but as a tool. She asked questions about how to ask better questions, about how to be less impressed by surface. Garrett and I spent an afternoon driving back to Millbrook, he in his truck, me in my car, because there are things the road reminds you of. The smell of hay after rain, the way odd alleys still hold the light from a childhood. We walked through the old diner where I have eaten my first paychecks and where the waitress still recognized us. He told me small things about how he had been manipulated, how certain flattery had been used as a tool to make him believe a picture and not the frame. He was contrite, there is no other word, and he seemed determined to learn how to discern more carefully. I started a modest scholarship in my grandmother's name, an actual fund with parameters and an application process. The first recipient was a young woman from Millbrook named Ava, who wanted to study hospitality management because she had watched her mother's hard work in a motel and dreamed of doing it differently. We had breakfast at the Monarch. She told me about her plans and the practical problems that stood between ideas and execution. Sitting across from her, I thought of my own 16-year-old self with a duffel bag and a particular confidence that the world could be fixed one small practice at a time. The scholarship was not a PR stunt. It was a deliberate mechanism for stewardship. I hired Naomi to be an occasional mentor for scholarship recipients who wanted to understand the financial side of running a business, how to read a ledger, how to spot a pattern of dishonesty, and when to call in professionals. Wesley took another scholarship onto the payroll, sponsoring internships for students who wanted to work in operations in exchange for mentorship. Rebecca spoke at a seminar about legal caution in business relationships. Agent Reeves came once and gave a talk on how to work with investigators and what to expect if you suspected fraud. Each of these was a thread in a larger tapestry I wanted to weave, not to burn bridges, but to build better ones. Patricia began therapy in earnest. She learned to sit with the disquiet that had always pushed her toward applause. I could not say I forgave her in the old, easy way, because forgiveness is a verb that often takes a long, patient season to complete. But we had conversations that mattered, about small betrayals and larger needs, and how to love someone who is learning to be smaller in order to be more truthful. When the Whitmore case went to court, months later, after months of discovery and motion practice, the town was quieter about gossip.
The process took the bluntness out of instant judgment and replaced it with a more sober cadence. Prosecutors filed charges. Defendants pled not guilty in many instances. Some matters were resolved through settlements. Others moved toward trial. I will not narrate every legal twist, because this is not a court transcript, but a life story. It was enough that the work we had done, Naomi's diligence, Rebecca's precision, Agent Reeves' action, had prevented a larger collapse and had protected many vendors who would otherwise have suffered. At the Monarch, life continued. We hosted a small luncheon for vendors to reassure them and to commit to paying any outstanding legitimate invoices promptly. I made sure the front-of-house staff could speak clearly about the hotel's position. We were transparent, and we would support our partners. It mattered not just materially, but morally. In hospitality, reputation is both currency and covenant. Months later, at a quiet breakfast in the same sunlit room where Ava had told me her plans, Garrett and I had another honest conversation. He had stepped back from the engagement with Sloan. "We're not compatible," was the sentence he'd used in the end, which hid a more complicated truth. He could not reconcile the woman he loved to the person the evidence described. He apologized for not seeing what I had seen earlier and for not asking the right questions. I forgave him in the manner adults do, in actions and in a slow loosening of old scripts. He began to help with small things at the Monarch that allowed him to see the work up close without his mother's applause acting as a buffer. There were tender reparations. Garrett handed back the necklace, again,
this time with a public note and an informal family dinner where he spoke plainly about his mistakes. He said he had learned how to look for patterns instead of personas. Stephen, the old diner owner, made chicken and biscuits. It was ordinary, awful, beautiful, and human. I hired Ava as an intern that summer. She learned the back-of-house rhythm and the front-of-house smile, the sort of integration that hospitality requires. Naomi taught her how to read balance sheets so she could spot trouble in the future. Rebecca mentored scholarship recipients about contracts. Agent Reeves came back for an alumni talk. Her presence underscored that the line between private kindness and public accountability need not be antagonistic. When the dust settled enough for me to look back in any clear way, I realized why I had stayed at the party at all. I had wanted selfishly to see whether the people who had dismissed me could be impressed by a ledger. But more than that, I had wanted to protect those people who had not the power to defend themselves, and to allow my family to choose dignity in the light of truth, rather than the dim glow of secondhand applause. My actions were not without cost.
There were friends who never returned, and there were evenings when the phone clicked like a metronome and there was no one on the other end. There were legal bills, and there was the kind of fatigue that comes from holding a truth in your hands until others could see it. But there were also things restored. A mother who could be gentler with herself, a brother who could be braver in the face of his own mistakes, a hotel that could look at its ledger and know it had been shielded. The opal, the thing Gran had given me, sat now in the small box in my office, where I sometimes took it out and let light crawl across it. It was a compass I had kept as much for its memory as for any superstition. Once, on a banal afternoon when the hotel hummed like a living thing, my mother came into my office and sat in the visitor's chair. She looked at the opal and then at me. "You kept it," she said, like a woman marveling at someone else's stubbornness. "I did," I said. "I needed a reminder of where I came from. I needed something small that reminded me to be kinder back." She nodded slowly. "Maybe being kind means telling the truth sometimes." "Maybe," I said. "Or sometimes it means making sure other people can keep their roofs above their heads." The final months were not cinematic. They were the work of normal people taking care of other normal people. We installed a training program at Birch that taught small business owners how to protect themselves from predatory networks. We partnered with a local community college for a certificate in hospitality finance. We set up a small, anonymous tip line that vendors could use to report suspicious invoice activity. Practical things. They were not trophies, they were infrastructure. At the scholarship breakfast where Ava returned as a young manager, I watched her move through the dining room with a confident, steady presence. She greeted guests by name, handled a complaint about a missed reservation with calm, and laughed at a joke by a waiter with the inclination of someone grounded. She made a small, pragmatic suggestion about linen notation that I filed away for the operations meeting. She was, in a small way, the person I might have been if I'd had a slightly easier path. I felt the familiar ache and the deep satisfaction of payback that was not spite, but stewardship. On an ordinary evening, after the breakfast service had cooled and the kitchen team had started to clean, I walked the Monarch's back hallway, the one I'd once traced with a business plan in mind. The lemon scent from the cleaner's closet still hung faintly in the air. I ran my fingers along the seam of the carpet and paused where the loose nail used to protrude. The light from the emergency exit painted a thin stripe across the floor. It was the sort of humbling detail that means more than any headline. People still sometimes asked me, half joking and half curious, how I had known to act. I had a simple answer then, and I have a simple answer now. I was tired of being invisible, I would say. So I did what invisible people do when they need to be seen. I gathered evidence, I got help, and I used the system to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. It is a strange thing to be underestimated, and then to become the person who holds the papers that undo a myth. There is no sweeter victory than watching a network of falsehood unravel in a way that leaves the real work intact. I did not set out to humiliate anyone for sport. The satisfaction was in the restoration of dignity and the protection of those at risk. They mocked me at my mother's birthday dinner until they realized who they were dealing with. The line had been both an opening and a lesson. Sometimes the people you dismiss have been holding your town together all along. And sometimes, when the ledger is right and the evidence is clear, the truth makes the room rearrange itself. If you've ever been underestimated or had a small, quiet victory of your own, share it in the comments. I read them, and they remind me why these stories matter. If you want to hear more of these true-to-life twists, hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from.